Digital Humanities Initiative. This is an institutional strategic initiative at the University of Toronto. It's been recently funded, and it emphasizes questions of power, social justice, and critical theory in making and analyzing digital technologies. So ours is a version of DH that places anti-racist, decolonial, feminist, and queer, trans, and non-binary work at its core, and which understands our current historic shift in digital technology as an opportunity for social and political transformation. And we generally foreground creative praxis, co-creation, public engagement, and community-based research in many of the projects in our initiative. We also offer fellowships to graduate and undergraduate students. We host postdoctoral fellows. In fact, we have a call that's just been announced in partnership with CLEAR. And please, we'll put a call in the chat about that. We provide seed funding and other research support to faculty researchers and provide training in critical DH methods. And we host a number of events, including our talk today. So to learn more about our work and our upcoming programs, please visit our website, dhn.utoronto.ca. And for those of you who are on Twitter, we'd love to hear your thoughts on Professor Risam's research. We'll be tweeting from the event, and please add your voice to the conversation, tag us at U of T DHN, or use the hashtag CDHI Talks. So we're very lucky today to be joined together by two brilliant DH scholars. Dr. Roopika Risam is joining us from Salem State University. And here at U of T, we have Dr. Bhavani Raman from University of Toronto, Scarborough, and also Tri-Campus Graduate Department of History at U of T, who will be introducing Dr. Risam and hosting the Q&A. So I'm just going to do a quick, brief intro for Bhavani, who will then go ahead and introduce our speaker. But Bhavani is an associate professor in the Department of Historical and Cultural Studies at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, as well as the Tri-Campus Graduate Department of History. She studied documentary practices of the early colonial information state in India in her book, Document Raj, which was published by Chicago 2012. And she's currently working on two projects. One is on meaning, time, and early colonial legal archives of British India. And the other project, which she's just begun, is a critical cartography project on colonial hydrology called Decolonizing Archives of Water, Data Justice, and Critical Cartography for a Post-colonial City, Chennai. So thank you very much. And Bhavani, I'm going to pass it over to you for the next phase of our exciting afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's such a pleasure to be able to introduce Roopika, Professor Risam to all of you. Professor Risam is going to talk to us about data empires then and now, excavating colonial data cultures, which is a topic that is not just timely, but I think has such a long genealogy in post-colonial theory that it's very exciting to have you here, Dr. Risam. Let me also introduce, before I introduce Dr. Risam's many, many accomplishments, I must say I was very struck by her kind of profile as somebody who does so many different things and brings together this really three-dimensional way of thinking about digital infrastructure, digital humanities infrastructure, both in her scholarly research and in her practice. So Roopika Risam is chair of secondary and higher education and an associate professor of education and English at Salem State University. Her research interests lie at the intersections of post-colonial and African diasporic studies, humanities knowledge infrastructures, and digital humanities. Risam's first monograph, New Digital Worlds, Post-colonial Digital Humanities and Theory, Praxis, and Pedagogy, was published by Northwestern University Press in 2018. She has since edited a number of volumes, Intersectionality in Digital Humanities, that came out of Amsterdam University Press in 2019, South Asian Digital Humanities, which is a volume that I've read with great interest, which came out with Routledge in 2020, and most recently, a co-edited collection, The Digital Black Atlantic, in the Debates in the Digital Humanities series, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2021. Her current book project is called Insurgent Academics, a Radical Account of Public Humanities, which traces a new history of public humanities through the emergence of ethnic studies, and is currently under contract with Johns Hopkins University Press. In addition, Roopika is also the co-editor of Reviews in Digital Humanities, which is a journal that provides peer reviews of digital humanities scholarship, and has won several grants from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment of Humanities, the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I could just go on, but I will say that out of all of that practice, she's currently developing the Global Du Bois project, which is a data visualization project on W.E.B. Du Bois. She co-directs Reanimate, an intersectional feminist publishing collective, and co-hosts Rocking the Academy, a podcast no doubt featuring some clash and featuring conversations with the very best truth tellers, she says, who are formulating a new vision for higher education. And now I want to sort of stop at this point and say Roopika has a fantastic website. There are different ways of accessing Dr. Risam's work, but I give you now Roopika Risam, Data Empires, Then and Now, Excavating Colonial Data Cultures. Roopika.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Elspeth for convening us, and Bhavani for your introduction, and to Danielle and everyone at CDHI for organizing my virtual visit. I am delighted to be here and to see so many friendly faces of collaborators and colleagues and audience and new people as well. I'm currently coming to you from Salem, Massachusetts, where we're located on the historical lands of the Namkeeg and Pawtucket Nation, which is stewarded today by the Massachusetts Tribal Nation. I'm going to be talking about the relationship between data and colonialism, beginning with the personal and then moving into analysis of the historical and ongoing relationships between data and colonialism. And then I'll wrap up with some implications for those of us who work with data or practice digital humanities today. And so this is actually the book after the book that I'm currently finishing. So this is the first time I'm presenting on this. So I really look forward to your questions and your feedback. So in the US, and maybe this is true for Canada as well, a common classroom activity in primary school is to make your family tree and to assemble your genealogical data in the form of a chart. No one tells you that this is one of your first forays into data visualization. Hopefully this is different now that we have more accepted understandings of how expansive a family can be in definition. But in the 1980s, when I was in school, we received a diagram, much like the one you can see here, with space for a mother, a father, siblings, aunts and uncles, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. And this chart provided a model for organizing information that we presumably had about the people who constructed our families. This was a perplexing assignment for me and for a number of people in my third grade class, based on the circumstances of our lives and our family histories. I remember two of my classmates who were adopted, struggling with where the biological parents whom they didn't know would fit on their tree. One friend with a blended family, another with a single parent family were equally stymied. And despite coming from a family with a heteronormative structure, I too found this assignment troubling. I could easily fill out the names for my parents, my grandparents, some of my aunties and uncles and cousins, but my parents have so many siblings that I needed a little assistance. And beyond that, the family tree looked really patchy. My father could produce his grandparents' names, but my mother couldn't, and my aunties and uncles were absolutely no help. So why these gaps in memory and these gaps in data? My parents and their siblings were born in the decade before and after the partition of India in 1947, when India and Pakistan became independent from the British Empire. My family is from Kashmir, one of the, at the time, princely states that was ruled by a sovereign in alliance with the British Crown during British colonial rule. Upon partition, rulers of the princely states tended to accede either to India or Pakistan. But Kashmir was unique in that it had a Hindu sovereign and a majority Muslim population, making the question of where to accede a fraught one. Kashmir was ultimately divided between India and Pakistan, which inaugurated more than 70 years of strife that remains ongoing. As Kashmiris who practice Sikhism, living in what is now Pakistan, my parents' families were forced to leave their homes and migrate to India, where my parents were refugees as children. Like many of my parents' generation who experienced the trauma and the disruption of partition firsthand, our pasts and our family histories are enshrouded with that trauma. My mom cannot recall the name of her grandfather, only that he was the head of their village and that he was executed in front of her grandmother in the turmoil of partition. Some stories are lighter. We have a running joke in my family about the inability to pin down my dad's age. According to his driver's license, he's turning 82 this year, but he swears it's 80. And because he didn't have a birth certificate, his high school graduation certificate, his leaving school certificate, was the basis for establishing his legal birthday. And he claims that he started school 2 years earlier than he should have because he's a genius, which is probably true. I was born in Wales and immigrated to the US, so my own existence has been documented by my Welsh birth certificate, but when we moved to the US, I was dismayed to find out that my Welsh birth certificate was of little utility because eventually it was superseded first by a green card and then later by a naturalization certificate. So as a child, completing my family tree data visualization, it struck me as strange that there wasn't a way to find the missing data. My father explained that per tradition, his birth was recorded on leaves of paper in his village, but no, we couldn't go find them, and they were definitely gone. And there was no explanation of why this was the case because my parents never, and I mean never, talked about partition. And it wasn't until I learned about it while reading Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children in college, which is, among other things, the story of a Kashmiri family, that I realized there was no way partition hadn't affected my family. And once I asked, they offered bits and pieces of information, which I've subsequently put together with other information gleaned from aunties and uncles and cousins, but the picture is far from complete. A story like mine isn't unique. In fact, the 1947 Partition Archive, a community archive and digital project that facilitates reporting of oral histories from people who lived through partition, responds precisely to this recalcitrant silence surrounding partition. It aims to gather and preserve those bits and pieces of information from the aging children of partition through which we can begin to make sense of that turbulent period and its implications for today. I begin with this story to highlight the ways that the personal and the political intersect to produce our individual and collective relationships to data. Unlike many people in the US, I can't go to a census or look up birth and marriage and death records or sign up for Ancestry.com and make my family tree. The destruction of our family records, the gaps and silences in the narratives that we elicit from our elders are shaped by trauma and shame. And this is a data legacy of colonialism. I also begin with this story to demonstrate that the personal relationship that I and my family as Kashmiris have to data, in that it's fraught, incomplete, and fragmentary, stands in sharp contrast to other data legacies of colonialism, namely the way that robust data collection and management played an instrumental role in the British Crown's ability to control, dominate, and subjugate its colonies. And this is what I want to focus on today. How do we understand the role of data in propping up the colonial project? And in turn, what implications does this knowledge have for our work in digital humanities today? I've noticed a disturbing trend in contemporary studies of data, the way that data is rarely understood to be historicized, the way that data is treated as an artifact of the present and of the future, and the neglect for data's pasts. This is particularly acute in scholarship about data colonialism. In The Cost of Connection, Nick Couldry and Ulises Mejia suggest that humanity has been colonized by data. And they argue that data is a contemporary frontier in a long history of colonialism. They argue that human experience, potentially every layer and aspect of it, is becoming the target of profitable extraction. They propose that although the modes, intensities, scales, and contexts of today's dispossession, and by that they mean the dispossession of our data, are distinctive, the underlying function remains the same as under historical colonialism, to acquire large-scale resources from which economic value can be extracted. Given the prevalence of big data and corporate control and ownership over the data that we are constantly generating, the extractive relationship between capitalism and data that they describe is certainly one that's important. However, in their positioning of data as a site of colonialism, they articulate a false binary between the past and the present of colonialism, using this term historical colonialism in a way that implies that colonialism is over and now being replaced by the colonizing of data. Now, I'm in the US, I know many of you are in Canada, and we know we live in settler colonial states, where colonialism is ongoing and decidedly not only historical. And those in former colonies that gained independence also recognize that the temporal end of colonialism was not, in fact, the end of colonialism in practice. But they just keep doubling down on their distinction between an allegedly historical colonialism and data colonialism in the present. And they argue, if historical colonialism annexed territories, their resources, and the bodies that worked on them, data colonialism's power grab is both simpler and deeper. The capture and control of human life itself through appropriating the data that can be extracted from it for profit. The distinction that Australian scholar Patrick Wolf makes between settler colonialism as a structure rather than an event is useful here. Couldry and Mejia's position colonialism as an event, the annexing of territory, the extraction of resources, the theft of labor, as if it happened and it's over. If that's true, then what of Indigenous people who remain colonized, who continue to fight the continual extraction of resources from land, like the water keepers who are trying to block the construction of the Keystone XL and the Dakota Access pipelines? And colonialism is not a historical artifact or an event to relegate to the past, but what Wolf calls a structure that begins with invasion and continues through the way the colonizer erects a new colonial society on the expropriated land base. Furthermore, to suggest that data colonialism's capture and control of human life itself is unique or distinct from colonialism proper is an exercise in erasure. It erases Indigenous ways of knowing that suggests that human life is not, in fact, discrete from land. It erases the history of chattel slavery, also an exercise in the capture and control of human life. Indigenous dispossession and genocide, as well as enslavement, are central to the rise of capitalism and colonialism, which are made possible by these acts of the annexation of human life to capital. I could continue with this critique for at least the rest of this talk, if not longer, but I will spare you. Where Couldry and Mejias are right is that capital annexes human life through data. Where they are wrong, I contend, is that they suggest this is only happening now or only happened in the last few decades. Conversely, I argue, the annexation of human life through data is foundational to the rise of capitalism and to the history of colonialism. European colonial cultures are data cultures. Essential to the colonial project is the use of data in service of annexing lands, extracting resources, and stealing labor, in part through its attempt to reorder and structure ways of knowing to align with what the colonizer terms rationality or modernity. Colonialism has always been a data regime made possible through the extraction of data, and data is a raw material for empire. In the English language, shifting definitions of data in the Oxford English Dictionary shed light on a long history of the relationship between data and colonialism. The term data, or its singular datum, arises from the Latin datum, or a given. The OED defines data in several ways. In its earliest usage, dated to 1646, data is a thing given or granted, something known or assumed as fact, and made the basis of reasoning or calculation, an assumption or premise from which inferences are drawn. In the source provided from 1646, from all this heap of data, it would not follow that it was necessary. Thus, the earliest known usage of data speaks to its power, that data is a basis for decision-making. By 1899, data comes to encompass facts, especially numerical facts, collected for reference and information, citing as its source tables and data for the use of students in engineering laboratories. The link between colonialism and data in the OED first emerges in its articulation of the word datum used in combination, for example, a datum line or a datum level. It cites the Science Journal in 1885, speaking of the horizontal datum plane adopted by German craniologists. Craniology was a form of colonial pseudoscience and scientific racism that studied the shapes and sizes of human skulls and derived racist theories about intellectual capacity of different racial groups from their study. In its articulation of data as a plural noun with singular verb construction, a source from 1902 in the OED continues hinting towards a relationship between data and colonialism. So 1902 from upstate New York, there is but little data to estimate Indian populations. And here Indian refers to Native people. The more contemporary technological understanding of data is documented to 1946. The quantities, characters, or symbols on which operations are performed by computers and other automatic equipment, and which may be stored or transmitted in the form of electrical signals, records on magnetic tape, or punched cards, etc. A source used from 1946 references IBM. The IBM card reader scans standard punched cards and causes data from them to be stored in relays located in the constant transmitter. As Edwin Black examines at length in IBM and the Holocaust, the Hollerith machines from IBM played a crucial role in automating data management to identify Jewish and Roma people, to develop deportation lists, and to track labor and people in the concentration camps. in short, automating Nazi Germany's genocidal campaign. As an aside, those of you who are familiar with the history of digital humanities will note that Father Busa's Index Thomisticus, to which humanities computing, which positions itself as a precursor to digital humanities, traces its lineage to Father Busa and the Index. That project involved a collaboration between Father Busa and Tom Watson of IBM and relied on IBM's punch card technology. So the ethical questions related to technologies and the methods that we use for our research are, in a sense, foundational to digital humanities. Prior to computation and later enabled by computation, the ability to turn information into data is by definition the ability to control the truth. Data becomes a tool to construct a reality and the tool to negate another's reality. And data can be a matter of life and death. This is why I contend that colonial cultures are data cultures. Data fits alongside navigation, the ship, and the gun as a technology of colonialism. Data and the development of a colonial data regime did not simply, as others have pointed out, facilitate the administration and management of empire. Rather, it was a foundational technology that made empire possible in the first place. Data not only possessed the power to transform lived experience into manipulable chunks, it also possessed the power to reorder the world, to replace local ways of knowing within European epistemologies, and to do so through the most innocuous and almost boring looking of documents: rolls and charts and maps and ledgers and manifests. What data was kept, who collected it, for what purposes, what data was destroyed? These questions all point to the sheer power that data put behind the colonial project. From building to sustaining to managing to ending an empire, data lies at the heart of the colonial enterprise. Building an empire requires the extraction of data about the places where one might expand. Colonial exploration and land surveys generated data about would-be colonies, and the data was subsequently visualized on maps. Well, we could pull any number of examples from the British Empire. I want to use the Americas as an example. From the perspective of European colonizers, spaces that were unmapped by them were seen as ripe for the picking, as terra nullius, Latin for land belonging to no one. To be the colonial state that surveyed and mapped the land was one part of staking a claim and making a bid for expansion into the so-called unmapped space, and to making treaties with Indigenous people to enclose their territory as European zone. Here, for example, is a map of Maryland and Virginia from 1673 based on a 10-year land survey, which gave the British critical data about the mid-Atlantic region in the US, such as the locations of Lenape, Susquehannock, and Chaptico residences in the region. Travelogues and other records from scouting editions rounded out visualizations of space by producing data about flora, fauna, and people living in the so-called terra nullius. Thomas Harriot's Brief and True Report of the Newfound Land of Virginia, of the Commodities and of the Nature and Manners of the Natural Inhabitants categorizes and catalogs extractable resources for commodities, to the point that he includes a table for ease of access to the various commodities that he found. His book also includes an ethnographic investigation of the indigenous peoples of Virginia. Later efforts in ethnography and demographic surveys offered a more systematic way of transforming lived experience into data. Extracting data about people, including their religions, was critical to invoking territorial claim under the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery originates in a papal bull from Pope Alexander VI in 1493, which stated that lands that weren't inhabited by Christians were available to be claimed. And the combination of land surveys and population data supported these claims. The doctrine of discovery became the bedrock of European land claims in the Western Hemisphere and would further influence the US's policy toward Native peoples, clearly through a series of court cases in the US Supreme Court, including 1823's Johnson v. McIntosh, which upheld that the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to lands in the Western Hemisphere. And this was then in turn used to justify manifest destiny and westward expansion in the US. But this data was not only used to document who was living in a particular place, it was also extracted with an eye towards the erasure of Indigenous people living in colonized lands. In her brilliant book, First Thing and Lasting on Native Peoples in New England, Jean O'Brien documents how demographic methods were used against Native people, often by manipulating how to count them in ways to suggest that they had vanished, and thus to justify expropriation of their land. So for example, only counting people who lived on reservation land as Indigenous people, or defining what it means to be Indigenous through blood quantum. And of course, this sort of manipulation of data connects to Bhavani's wonderful work in Document Raj in the context of India. Sustaining an empire further required extraction of massive amounts of data. Population rolls, censuses, tax assessment rolls, trading rolls, ledgers, land registry records. These are just a few examples of the data that sustained the empire. To assess the wealth and health of the empire required the data generated through these undertakings. The blue books were one way that the British did this, sending the blank books to the colonies each year, expecting them returned filled with statistics attending to the economic well-being of the colony. So taxes, public works, expenses, staff, payroll, population, education, public health, and so on. You can see an example here of the Barbados Blue Book from 1892, the contents. Imperial gazetteers in India were also critical sources of data. The East India Company began publishing gazetteers in 1815, and a practice that the British Crown continued from 1858 to 1947. And these document descriptive and economic data, histories of space and place, and an atlas and an index. The extraction of the data itself is an act of empire, of domination, subjugation, and sustaining authority, and of surveillance. But in turn, the extraction of data was integral to the generation of wealth through trade, taxation, theft of labor, and usurpation of natural resources. Therefore, data served as a raw material for empire in at least two ways. Data was a form of information that in turn assisted with colonial rule. And data was a form of capital underpinning the economies of empire and assisting with the generation of colonial wealth. So what does an empire do with all this data? Managing an empire is, in a sense, the managing the data of empire and vice versa. Scholarship in archival science and post-colonial studies has amply examined how colonial archives, where many of these records and documents live, are implicated in colonial violence and a politics of knowledge intended to subjugate colonized people, and are accordingly filled with gaps and omissions that offer an incomplete documentary record of colonialism. In addition to the forms of data extracted from colonies that I've previously mentioned, like in the Blue Books and in the gazetteers, It's crucial to understand the collections of records and documents that contain data and other sources of information as data themselves. And here I'm evoking the crucial work of Thomas Padilla, Laurie Allen, Stuart Varner, Sarah Potvin, Elizabeth Rusey-Roque, and Hannah Frost on collections as data. This perspective offers insight on the data management policies developed to manage the empire and its data. Taking the British Colonial Office's records as an example, we find a series of fluid and evolving systems for dealing with the vast amounts of data extracted from colonies. Without databases, algorithms, or other computational technologies, the British Colonial Office generated their own processes for data management. Here's an example from 1862 of managing correspondence into what's called cuts that corresponded to various governmental departments. You can see them listed on the right-hand side of this image. This is for correspondence pertaining to the West Indies from 1862. Inside each cut, as you can see here, was essentially a registry of correspondence. The British Colonial Office also used indexes. So here's an index for Jamaica covering a range of topics. And for each index topic, entries. So you can see the entry for distress. This is the correspondence for distress. For certain periods, they also maintained précis books that offered more detail on correspondence. And that's, here's an example of that from Jamaica as well. What's crucial to note is that centralized data management was never deployed. And thus, even today, records remain dispersed in archives around the world, from collections held at different libraries in the UK, not just in the National Archives, and records located in the National Archives of former colonies. This is as much a strategy that accounts for the challenges of pre-computational data management as much as it is a strategy of subterfuge, an intentional disaggregation of parts, obscuring the sum of the whole, and thus rendering it quite difficult to grasp the broader picture of colonial domination, and certainly the broader picture of its data. So then what do you do when your empire is ending? Using the British as an example, again, the answer is destroy your compromising data. To wit, in 2013, as part of a declassification of documents, the British Foreign Office was forced to reveal a systematic attempt to destroy any material that might embarrass Her Majesty's government, members of the police, or the military, public servants, informers, anything that might betray intelligence sources, or that might be used unethically, in their words, by ministers in the successor government. Codenamed Operation Legacy, that's Orwellian, if I've ever heard an Orwellian term, this initiative spawned bonfires, massive document purges and data purges in the declining years of the British Empire. In Rhodesia, for example, the order to colonial officials was to destroy anything that would be likely to be interpreted either reasonably or by malice as indicating racial prejudice or religious bias on the part of Her Majesty's government. The British Foreign Office is probably really glad there's no Wayback Machine for all of this. They offered specific instructions for not only how to dispose of documents and data, but also how to cover up the disposal of it. So there were these sort of descriptions of instructions, after the bonfires, the waste should be reduced to ash, the ash is broken up, disposal at sea was permitted so long as the documents were packed in weighted crates and dumped in very deep and current-free water at maximum practicable distance from the coast. They also introduced a really complex classification scheme for access to records. So, for example, DG files could only be seen by British officers of European descent. Those that were marked guard were only for British officials from the old Commonwealth, i.e. the white countries, predominantly white countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, for example, and so on. But recognizing that data is absolutely central to colonialism, it's also crucial to recognize that colonized people do not submit quietly to colonialism's data regimes, and instead they have a long history of creating ways of resisting it. To speak to just one contemporary example of this, of the tremendous work on Indigenous data sovereignty that's being done is a crucial form of resistance. The United States Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network defines Indigenous data sovereignty as the right of a nation to govern the collection, ownership, and application of its own data. It derives from tribes' inherent right to govern their own peoples, lands, and resources. The right to data sovereignty is supported by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including Article 18, which states that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights in accordance with their own procedures. Taking the recent US Census as an example. So census data in the US is collected to allocate seats, the number of seats a state has in the House of Representatives in Congress, and to allocate federal funds to local communities. Accordingly, to promote an Indigenous sovereignty-driven approach to the 2020 census, the National Congress of American Indians urged all tribal leaders to articulate to the Census Bureau what vital statistics or data means to their communities, and to protect the confidentiality of information submitted by Native people. The matter of Indigenous data sovereignty has gained traction, particularly in response to the 2018 International Open Data Charter, which argues for the importance of open data, which they define as digital data that is made available with the technical and legal characteristics necessary for it to be freely reused, redistributed by anyone, anytime, anywhere. Responses to this that seek to support open data while still protecting the sovereignty of Indigenous people include the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance developed by the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group. So collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. I want to conclude by briefly outlining what a historicized view of the relationship between colonialism and data gives us for our work in digital humanities today. In my book, New Digital Worlds, I gesture towards the practices of a post-colonial digital humanities, the work we must do to address the gaps and omissions in the cultural record, which are hallmarks of colonialism, as we as digital humanities practitioners are constructing a digital cultural record. If we don't attend to the ways that the texts, manuscripts, and archives that comprise the cultural record are inflected by colonialism as we are developing a digital cultural record, then we are reproducing colonial violence in epistemic form. And worse, we're amplifying it as multiple publics continue to look to digital sources for information. You can probably see from my personal narrative at the beginning of this talk why my research is focused on the issues that it is, and my own preoccupation with the loss of stories, the loss of a documentary record, the loss of data, the loss of representation affected by colonialism. So what does this mean for how we might approach the data dimensions of digital humanities in ways that avoid rehearsing colonial dynamics, or really any of us who work with data? How do we go forward? And here are just a few ideas. While working with data, it's imperative to foreground for ourselves, our research team, our users, that a data set is not a neutral pool of information. Rather, it's an intentionally gathered and organized collection. If we're collecting our own data, we need to interrogate the methods we are using. If we're using extant data sets, we need to examine their collection methods. Who collected it? For what purpose? What kinds of questions are being asked in data collection? To what ends? What are the terms and the controlled vocabularies used in the collection of data? And who got to determine what those are? Who has access to this data? What forms of consent were obtained for data that's transforming lived experience? What's in the data set and what's not? And why? That is to say, we need careful attention to non-extractive methods, to consent and sovereignty, and to gaps and omissions in the data. When we work with data and data visualization, it's crucial to remember and to foreground for users, this is a piece that everybody tends to miss, that we're telling stories with data. We're not creating objective displays of information. We're creating representations. And these representations are shaped not only by the issues related to the data sets that I just mentioned, but also by the data that is and isn't available. Going back to several points I made earlier, the tension between the fraught and fragmentary nature of personal data and what can feel like a towering data regime of colonialism, or even how the decentralization of colonial records obscures a bigger picture, we're almost always contending with incompleteness. These forces shaping data visualization must be made legible to users, particularly because most people have really low levels of data literacy and graphical literacy. I think that the last 2 years have brought that home. And there's a tendency of users to treat data visualization as objective scientific fact and truth. So while aiming for a non-extractive approach to data is a start, our ultimate goal must be redistributive approaches. To what extent, for example, can our work participate in the rematriation of data and of cultural heritage to communities from which it has been stolen? How can we build meaningful and lasting relationships with community partners, bringing them into our research processes in equitable collaborations through which we work as equals? As we bring our expertise, so too do they bring theirs. A redistributive approach to data is at odds with how the Academy of the Global North or the West construct itself as having the sole domain over the production of knowledge. However, these academic practices are fundamentally colonial. Therefore, our responsibility is to treat those who hold or keep knowledge in spaces outside of the academy as equal collaborators, part of the whole life cycle of a project, from identifying research questions to designing methods, to implementation, to decision-making about dissemination. And this means often putting aside our preconceived notions of what a project should look like, the form it should take, where it should go, or even what one as an academic gets out of it. Just to give you an example, I had some grant funding, and my general idea was, how can we introduce Black and Latinx high school students to digital humanities? So I went to a school where I had relationships, and together the principal and a teacher and I discussed how, this idea and the money I had to bring them would fit in with the goals that they had. So we developed a project, we collaboratively worked with the students, and because they were minors, the end result was a great project that is not open to the public for the privacy and the protection of the students. But my ability to do anything with it as an academic, to put it on my CV or whatever, is sort of irrelevant to me, because we met our collaboratively developed goals based on what they needed. And so, namely, the school was looking for a way to try and engage a class of high school students in the spring of their final year who are in danger of not graduating. And so often, these kinds of opportunities tend to go to the honors students, but they said they really wanted to use it to try and see if they could engage their students and get them through to the finish line. And that was great for us because we at Salem State, because that was, these are the students we serve. So it was wonderful for us. And we did, right? So they did a capstone project. They came to Salem State, they went in the archive, and it was great. I mean, they all graduated. 7 of them even came to Salem State, which was an unexpected and pleasant surprise. So, I mean, this can be done. Along these lines, a final consideration is how we can use our work and our resources to promote broader scale data and digital literacy. There are a great many digital divides: economic, rural versus urban and suburban, divides between race and ethnicity and indigeneity, divides between nations, among others. To more fully realize the promises of digital humanities, we must mobilize our skill sets towards erasing these divides. Those of us who have strengths in these literacies have so much to share. The way I've done it has been primarily in collaboration with teachers and schools and community partners. So we always think about whether it's useful to develop data literacy or digital literacy workshops as part of our projects and to build that in. I've seen great examples of projects that have developed curricula that they're available along with a project that are for either school children or for communities to think about how to use the projects. And others do so, I mean, in many ways, right? Sharing, I know people who just share what they know at local events in their communities. If we do an event here in Salem, and I have colleagues who, just go into do digital literacy as an offering as part of our community events. Possessing the knowledge of how the data legacies of colonialism manifest in the present and in our own work isn't enough. We must actively be envisioning the practices that shift away from extractive and towards redistributive approaches to data. And those of us who hold this knowledge have a responsibility to share it and act on it. And that's the contribution that we must and we can make towards undoing the colonial practices of data. And bonus, the colonial practices of the academy. Thank you, and I look forward to the Q&A. I would love to hear what strategies have worked for you.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so very much, Roopika. You've really, I think, opened up so many different worlds of history, of practice, of future making, reworlding. I'm going to open the floor for questions, comments, responses. There's the chat function, which you can use to express yourself, but I think we would all really love it if you could actually switch your mic on and speak. Maybe while people are getting warmed up, I can jump in and maybe start off the discussion and say that, there were a couple of themes that really stood out for me in your presentation. One is, I think, the way you showed us, I think, that there's a kind of a value-making logic to data harvesting or information harvesting that endures despite the fact that that information is often error-prone, manipulatable, misinformed, shall we say. And so there is a kind of a context-making aspect to that whole plane of data creation, which creates its own value. And I was very reminded actually of the similarity between the colonial information management practices that you kind of broadly sketched and say, the kind of smart projects that we see kind of flourishing around us as kind of objects of speculation. And I wondered if you could maybe start us off by thinking, thinking through that kind of resonance. And then I have a whole bunch of other things, but maybe I'll just have you start us off with that.
It's true. I mean, I think that there's been a real struggle to understand how do we make sense of, how do we order, how do we understand the data saturated environments that we find ourselves in now. And there's very much a movement towards a kind of instrumental view of data and a perception that it is, because it is quantifiable, it is somehow scientific or objective. And, I think about, for example, so I'm a Pelotoner, in full disclosure, although if you follow me on Twitter, you know that. So I love my Peloton and my Peloton app, and, hooking up my heart rate monitor and quantifying myself and sitting around analyzing it, making spreadsheets and trying to divine if my cardiovascular health is improved. And at the same time, right, we have to be thinking about what are the biases and the presumptions that have found their way into the code, have found their way into the algorithms by virtue of the people who are coding, right? And so this is very much about how do we move and shift the thinking of, I think, both general publics, but also people who are in the positions of being coders and being makers and designing algorithms to push this. And I mean, I find that Ruha Benjamin's work on the new Jim Code is really wonderful in analysis of this. To some extent, in her analysis of the Google algorithms, that Satya Noble's algorithms of oppression is useful as well in terms of understanding why certain things hit higher on Google than others. I think that it's very much, I think there's a theme between, data management as it's practiced in industry and colonial data management, recognizing that it's now computationally driven. So, in a sense, I don't think that, the writers of The Cost of Connection are particularly wrong in their analysis of data today, but more so in the way that they, I think, are neglecting a continuum between earlier data management practices and today's data management practices.
And I think also what you make very clear, and this is where I think the contemporary experience of our, data world, as it were, can help rethink some of those, historical understandings of colonial data management, right? So there's a kind of a reverse, there's a kind of a Benjaminian back and forth, as you can see. And I think part of that learning that we can do from today is the kind of the capacious network effect of information itself, right? And so I think we have this, as historians, have a fairly turgid sense of the centralization of information as one of the pillars of colonial empire making. And what you kind of realize is that's not necessarily the case. I mean, and this is something that people have talked about, which is that information is unevenly documented. And strategically unevenly documented. And so there are kind of black holes in some senses, which allow for an unaccountability to flourish as part of colonialism as well, right? So there's a sort of a very interesting story here of data as a form of, monumentalizing colonialism, but also the possibility of data as accountability.
Yeah, and this is, something that I've been thinking a lot about in some of the work I've been doing with Du Bois and data. So I'm working on a series of data visualizations, mostly related, but not exclusively related to the W.B. Du Bois archive, which has been digitized at University of Massachusetts Amherst. And, but one part of this project actually was working on with students, which is looking at what might the attendees of the Pan-African Congresses and various related events, conference, Congress, they are also going under a lot of different names, not just under Pan-Africanism in the title. What could that tell us, about sort of who's engaged in this network? Turns out the answer is it doesn't tell us a lot. because you eventually get 8 people who you expect who are attending the most events, and then, you don't. But I mean, I was really just trying to teach students about, data fallacies and, utopian approaches to working with data. But what we did find in many cases was that we had numbers from news reports or programs about these events saying how many people were there. So we had a generally good sense of what we knew and what we didn't know. And I think that's often very unusual. Often, like, we find what we can find and we don't really know what we don't know. And this is actually a case where in a number of these events, we know exactly how many people we can document were there versus how many people attended, ostensibly, assuming these numbers are right. And so, one of the really interesting questions I've been thinking about is, how do we visualize absence? How do we visualize the relationship and the proportion of what we know to what we don't know? Because I think what often happens, particularly with digital humanities projects, is that, when something is there, there's a presumption on the behalf of the viewer or the user that, it's there and maybe the other things aren't there. Sometimes they are there, but digital humanities has a discovery problem in terms of finding projects, which is a different issue. But then sometimes they're not. But just because they're not documented in a project or documented in an archive didn't mean they never existed, right? So thinking about how do we show, absence is sort of, I feel like, the question that perplexes me all the time.
Well, you raise a very good point. I think for a lot of, colonial historians who go to the colonial archive, right, the index that is given to you by the research officer, I think we saw some images that you shared, is precisely the work where you have to call up the forensic body of the archive and sort of look at it and use the index as a kind of, do a kind of counter diagnosis of the index to see where you might find, things that escape, or things that are shadowed, or things that are suppressed by the telling that the archive wants you to, tell in a way, right? I see I see a comment in the chat box, and I'm just going to read this out. This is the Jwalia, who says, "Thank you so much for sharing your story, knowledge, and thoughts. Could you talk about anti-colonial styles of dataset documentation and digital project documentation? Are there any methods that are moving away from the traditional incomplete, biased forms of documenting data towards more equitable solutions?"
That's a really good question. I like to think about this in terms of a lot of the work that's being done on migration and data visualization, particularly with migration to Europe over the last, oh my gosh, it's almost a decade now, right? Since 2014, this large scale migration to Europe has produced a somewhat alarming number of data visualizations. And I'm going to put the name of one of them because it's so buggy. It's actually so bandwidth intensive that if I share my screen on Zoom, it's going to seize up. But I'm going to drop it in the chat for you. But essentially, this one called the Flow Towards Europe actually really typifies what happens when people just have access to data sets because they're data, and then just make data visualizations because they can. And so if you look at this project, you'll see what looks like these unimpeded flows of migrants just coming at Europe, right? And very much articulates this kind of narrative of migrant crisis. Migrants are a problem. They're violating the security of the border, the economic well-being of the European nation state, and so forth. And there have been, among these sort of that being the trend, there are a couple of great examples of projects that have, taken a different approach. One is called, again, I'll drop these in the chat. One is called Crossing the Mediterranean Sea by Boat, which is out of Warwick in the UK. And then another is called XOD, which was created by data gathered by Doctors Without Borders in Italy. And these projects are really interesting in that, they're more of a mixed methods project. I mean, they do include some quantitative data, but they also include qualitative data. They're very much testimony and narrative driven. And the approach is really offering migrants an opportunity, if they wish, to tell their own stories in their own terms, with their own categories, their own ontologies. And that's really where I see a kind of intervention with data that's really important, is sort of not simply relying on the available data set produced by an NGO like the UN Refugee Agency for the explicit purpose of the surveillance and management of migrants, but instead a different methodological approach that can offer counter narratives to this sort of governmental narrative. One project that I was involved in called Torn Apart Separados, and I'll share a link to this as well. It's a series of data visualizations that responded to the family separation policy that the Trump administration put into practice in 2018 in the US. And it's kind of a weird story, long story behind this project, but what ended up happening is we felt like so what happened is the US government announced that when children and families arrived at the border, that they would be separated from each other, detained separately. There's huge outcry about this. And several of my friends who are digital humanists and I, were observing everyone we knew, wringing their hands and feeling so helpless to do anything. So we thought, what could we do? And we have this sort of vague sense that if we could just aggregate the locations of the children's shelters, we could get them into the hands of the lawyers and the social workers who are working with migrants to make it a little bit easier to figure out where their children were. At the time, there was no aggregated list because the US government said, for the safety of the children, there's no aggregated list. So we ended up finding them through just being really weird researchers, going through going through foundation tax documents for the nonprofit organizations that ran the children's shelters and looking at who was the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement giving block grants to, and then just like calling them up and checking the phone book. And within a week, we had gathered all of the locations, 113 children's shelters, and we had the only list. So we were able to get the word out through the media, through Wired, a story in Wired magazine, through Washington Post, and we're able to and we were also talking to and working with social workers who are working with migrants at the border and get that data to them, which is not like a huge thing, right? I mean, but it was a small thing, but we also then ended up creating data visualizations thinking, well, let's tell the story of let's tell the story of the landscape of immigrant detention and its relationship to carcerality in the US through data visualizations. And so that's the first main data visualization that comes up under Torn Apart. So those are some examples of which, for us, it was, how do we use data visualization to put the gaze back on the state, rather than in contrast to all of these stories like the Flow Towards Europe that got told through the gaze of the state.
I think that's really the key point here, right? Which is that there's a kind of counter narrativization, a counter visualization, a counter practice that is always about reversing that gaze. And what's interesting is that, the XP project, the ones about the child centers, is a kind of creation of a register in the aftermath of missing data and missing children, right? And so there is a kind of loss that is enacted by the refusal to share, or certain protocols that don't allow for the sharing of data and you kind of, you have to identify that and see what you can do in that context. But I guess I want to move on to maybe asking you a related question, which you mentioned in your talk, which is this kind of idea of open data and shared data, right? And that can come with its own kind of hazards in some senses, because it does mean you have to think very carefully about what are you opening up to whom and how, and who's likely to, I suppose, use that open data, right? And it's not just a simple case of kind of dropping it out into some kind of, open black hole and, seeing what comes out at the other end of it. So I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit more on your thought process and your practice around that.
Yes, and actually the Torn Apart project is a great example of that. So, I was working with a fairly large team, there's 7 or 8 of us, all of whom had done work in digital humanities and in the context of the US, where open data is sort of the
anthem, right?
Say, right? Data just wants to be free, as the saying goes, right? Now, the US government was saying we're not aggregating the list for the safety of the children, but our conversations were actually, should we make the data available to everyone who just comes to the website and wants to click on a dot? Should we make the addresses available specifically? And this was, in the week that we spent building our project, this was really the key sticking point, because I kept saying, we've seen on the news and we've heard from the social workers that as children are being transited through airports, crowds are coming to express their support and protest the government, but they are scaring traumatized children. And so I very much was saying, no, this cannot be data that you can click on and get an address, because I was concerned that well-meaning people without experience working with vulnerable children, without working with migrants, would just show up at these places being well-meaning, but potentially inviting state violence into a place where vulnerable children were being housed. And so that was actually the decision we made. So you actually cannot, if you click on one of the purple dots of the private juvenile detention facilities, you actually can't get an address. Now, they are all in JavaScript object notation format. So if you know how to scrape the data out of the console, you can get it. But I mean, at that point, if you're going to that much effort, good luck. This became a matter of concern when we were approached by media outlets about sharing the data. So Washington Post's data visualization team, they wanted the data. So my colleague Alex Heel and I, sorry, my cat is apparently wants to visit. Alex Heel and I got on the phone with Washington Post, and we said to them, listen, here are our values and our ethics around sharing this data and making it open. And, we want to ensure that if we give you our data, will you handle it with the same protocol that we've developed for what we believe to be the safety of children? And they agreed. Similarly, ProPublica, which is, their shtick is make everything open. ProPublica wanted it too. And they would not agree to not put the addresses on there. And so we didn't give them their data. So those are some of the real considerations about protecting people. I mean, really, my ethos on this is think about and put the most vulnerable people at the center of decision-making. And consult experts who can help you with that decision, right? So we were talking to social workers to sort of help understand what they were seeing and how do we prevent perpetuating what they were seeing with protesters.
I mean, in some senses, it's also an invitation to take responsibility for the power one wields as a researcher and as a constructor of knowledge, right? I think what I think colonial knowledge histories teach us, and I think this is also the case, as you point out, with DH context as well, is that however, you might try, and even in a current kind of critical DH context, you might try and keep the knowledge base as collaborative as possible, but the custody of the data and the circulation of data is still something that you bear a lot of power over as a researcher, especially if you are a researcher in an institution like a university. that has a very kind of, has capacity in a way, right? That a community organization might not.
Yeah, and I think that's where the ethics of collaboration are really crucial. And so we've been doing some of this work at my university with other universities in Massachusetts around how do we articulate what the ethics of community engaged research in our state looks like. And it's really been an important conversation. And really, when we come down to it, it's really about, we can't have this ethics of kind of the light of knowledge in the university goes out into the community and, collaborates. If you do that, that's how you do violence, right? But instead that, there needs to be this sort of multi-directional back and forth across the boundaries of the university and the community, where we're recognizing expertise, we're inviting the expertise to be part of the work that we do from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
These are the ethical practices.
I see, Elspeth, you've said something. Maybe you want to speak.
Well, sure. I mean, I do all sorts of work with community-based oral histories, and so this is my whole world. All of this because of there's so many complexities around collaboratively co-creating narratives and oral histories, and some of the complexities around positionality vis-a-vis the university versus being in the community, and whose labor is being involved and who's getting paid and how they're getting paid, and whatever. But within archives, there's a shift towards thinking about post-custodial relationships. So moving away from a conceptualization that the goal of the archive is to collect artifacts, data, and maintain them, but instead to think about the ways in which perhaps there could be collaborative relationships with communities, community organizations, or sometimes individual knowledge keepers within particular communities who are sort of the lay archivists, if you will, for a social movement, for example. So what are the ways in which a community archive, for example, can make the expertise that is associated with staff members or volunteers, make that expertise available to community organizations in non-extractive ways? So that's a big shift for archives to think about letting go of collecting, of the project of collecting. So it's really interesting to see, which organizations are doing this and how they're doing it, because it's, really long-term relations and trust building that happen between people who are dealing with these questions long-term and various community members whose data, stories, however you want to describe it, are being collected and preserved for whom, I guess, long-term, theoretically, other members of that community. But sometimes collecting that material and sticking it in an archive is not the most ethical approach, right? So I think there's been some really creative thinking about that from a kind of radical archives perspective that maybe DH people could benefit from. But I also want to say, Roopika, I so appreciated your lecture, because in my other life where I'm associate VP research, I've been in all these conversations about data science and data science institute, data science this, data literacy, data account, on and on and on. And I'm usually the lone humanist in the room. And it's really swimming upstream really often, because it's just a different landscape of thinking about data. And these conversations are absolutely critical, but it feels like there needs to be a critical mass of, STS and or, humanist approaches to thinking about these questions in alongside, the physicists and the computer scientists and all the other people who are having this conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, I think that, in both the case of what university are, obviously there's more than just university archives, but what university archives are doing and what's happening with data science, I think are also point to the fact that one of the challenges that we contend with is to the university as a I don't even know. I'm like, what do I want to call the university today? The university's sort of interest in their bottom line, their interest in extracting value, right, from us, from staff members, from students, from communities, right? That I think of Devarian Baldwin has this amazing book. I want to say it's called In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, and it's all about universities' relationships to surrounding communities and cities. It's a really wonderful book, and it really. But when you are talking to an administrator about a different approach to archives, right? Then they're wondering, well, if we're not getting the value of having an archive or a collection, right? Then what's the point, right, of investing our resources in that? And that's the same with data science too, right? A lot of data science is about, ooh, it's the new thing. Ooh, we'll get the enrollments, right?
But as
Well,
it's not redistributed. Sorry.
go right ahead, Pavani.
No, I just said that as you were just saying, it's not redistributed. It's literally about aggregating value from enrollment. Go ahead.
Leslie.
Hi, thank you, Roopika. Thoughtful talk and got me really thinking a lot about a lot of issues. So I hope my question makes some sense. So I was thinking more about what you were suggesting in terms of anti-colonial practices and data collection. And I've been thinking about some of these practices, but ultimately we're still relying on a set of tools that are equally non-neutral, that are actually have well colonized by those who make those tools. And so I was wondering if you can comment on the issue of infrastructure of data, right? Because I think we tend to think about data, we question data, but we forget to question the infrastructure that make data possible in the first place.
Yeah. I'm writing this down because it's such a wonderful question. This is the perennial problem. I mean, there are open source tools people use. Open source, a tool being open source, however, is not a guarantee that it's not problematic, obviously. But certainly in terms of like moving away from some of the evil empires of Microsoft and Facebook or whatever, Twitter, there are sort of tools that people are developing. I think also, fundamentally, one of the challenges is that, internet technologies themselves have deeply colonial implications. When we think about e-waste and the dumping of e-waste in countries in Africa, for example, that becomes, or the mining, right? The mining of metals needed for computing. Yeah, I haven't figured out the answer to this question, right? Of what do we do? I mean, one of the initiatives that I've been involved in is called minimal computing. And Alex Thiel and I have a special issue of minimal, funny, Nicole's about to talk about minimal computing. Alex Thiel and I have a special issue of Digital Humanities Quarterly on minimal computing coming out. And at least 2 people I've seen in the audience are in that special issue. And we really think about, are there different practices we can adopt that kind of are somewhat liberate us from high bandwidth practices, high bandwidth technologies, from corporate platforms as well. Alex, for example, has with Mari Nairap at Columbia, has developed WAX. Yeah, so Nicole is just like posting your links. So this is actually helpful. I'll do it myself. Developed WAX, which is a way of creating digital editions just using spreadsheets and some workflows. And, it's definitely, it has some advantages in that it's working with static data files, and therefore they're easy to transmit, they're low bandwidth. You know, I think there's a level we can never get away from of the role of technology sort of as or computational technology as being fundamentally rooted in colonialism. But I think there are also practices and tools that we can develop that are slightly less evil, I suppose.
Nicole, do you want to come in and maybe share some thoughts? I can see there are lots of, you've dropped on a number of things in the chat.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Eichmann-Kauer. I'm a digital humanities librarian and assistant professor at University of Colorado Boulder, traditional lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute Nations. I base my DH class on Roopika's book, New Digital Worlds. And we have been experimenting with minimal computing or lateral infrastructure, in particular, thinking about that for our project, Digital El Diario. It's digitalldiario.com, which is it's a DH project that it sort of started with this idea of archival recovery of a Chicano student newspaper that was published here at CU in the 70s and 80s. And there's a real traumatic history surrounding it. And so I'm sort of really finding these conversations resonating, and sort of, you know, there's the technical approaches that we can apply, right? Minimal computing, lateral infrastructure, lib static, but to really take a step back and address this issue of abstraction and how we sort of, right, describe these artifacts, and sort of just thinking about like that stewardship and white gaze that can come with this too. I don't think I'm just sort of talking stream of consciousness, but I think what could be relevant here is that this data it's in the way that El Diario is sort of created was from a colonial perspective. I think was like, that's how it was initiated. And so there's been a lot of backtracking on my part and really slowing things down. And I think that that's really been important for the progress, or rather the collaboration more than anything with the founders of the newspaper, which is integral to this. So having Juan Espinosa, who created the newspaper in 73 or 72, sorry, he's come into my class and, talked with folks about this history, and not just that, but like he's collaborating with us to address, like, how are we going to describe these articles that he and his team wrote in the 70s? Are we doing this well? Because it's me and two other students and we're all white women. This is, hey, we got to slow down here. So I'm really excited by this, as you can tell since I keep talking. But Roopika, your work really, really resonates, and all of this is, I think, part of the future, if not should be the present, of how we approach digital humanities, from this very critical engagement with data as objects, data as historical objects, as we create them, like how our biases are built into them. So like things like data feminism certainly are important for that. I will stop. Thank you, Roopika.
To say, Nicole, your work with Scott Weingart on the, quantifying DH and its practices has been super influential for me. Actually helped me write part of a chapter of the book and another article. So I really am grateful for your work. But what I was thinking is, I love the example that you have with El Diario of, maybe we didn't get it right the first time, and now how do we reevaluate our practices? I mean, I think if more projects were to do that, we would be in much better shape. I think of another example that's done this is Livingston Online, which is the archive of the writing of David Livingston, colonialist par excellence. And, when Adrian Wisnicki and Megan Ward took over the project from its previous creators, they're very much interested in these conversations around post-colonial digital humanities, and really took seriously how do you create or reimagine digital archive of a white colonizer in a way that avoids a hagiographic kind of treatment. And so, they have this piece on Livingston in context, and they bring in other texts of, contemporaries offering sometimes critical perspectives on him. So I feel like this is what work we need to do in terms of rethinking our practices.
Mm-hmm. Which is, I think you're suggesting that a key point is also a kind of pedagogical exercise where you scaffold a digital artifact with various forms of commentary so that the pathway to that artifact is mediated by a whole set of critical frames. And that thing doesn't just emerge from the internet as some direct object to be, apprehended and sort of absorbed into some other kind of extractive knowledge making. And I also got the sense from you that rather than have sort of complete open access versus complete secrecy, again, the idea of filtering seems to be really important to your practice. So just like the scholarly scaffolding, I think the filtering in terms of, in the Torn Apart website, in terms of how people get at the information and the kind of filters you set up to mediate that access, I thought was another interesting way of thinking about a kind of a counter practice, right?
Yeah, I think this is the nice thing about digital humanities is it's very much about trial and error and experimenting, which can be bad sometimes, when you want something to just show for it, if you want to raise or something, right? It's challenging because sometimes, you think you're going to do something and it turns into something different, or you have to really play around with the technology to achieve an outcome. And it's very iterative, and, your first pass may not be the right one, or it may not make sense, or it may not work, technically speaking. So I think it's very much about an experimental approach to figuring out how to, calibrate your approach to data.
I wonder if that same principle could be applied in response to Leslie's question, right? Which is about the more sort of the kind of the brute extraction, in a sense, that underlies the simple fact of computing, let alone the access of bandwidth and so on. And I'm wondering whether, other than sort of minimal computing, there's also something to be said for figuring out what is sustainable as a project, and really thinking about the long-term sustainability of, not just the sunset clause on a digital project, but what is archivable or what might survive, and sort of think through its potential afterlife, even as a kind of something that's stored or archived, right? And then that might influence some of the choices you might make. So it could be that you don't do an open source, you don't use an open source platform, but you do something else, because the long-term sustainability of a project might mean something else, right? I'm just kind of throwing it out there for a response, both from Leslie and you, in a way.
Actually, so Nicole just put in the chat what I was going to say, which apparently is going to be the theme today. The Endings project at the University of Victoria just has these absolutely great principles they're developing. So how do you plan for that from the very beginning? Some of the static technologies that are part of minimal computing are also part of what they're advocating for as well, but they go beyond that, well beyond that, into sort of thinking about various aspects of a project and preservation. I think in terms of, going back to Leslie's question and negotiating those tensions of technological malfeasance beyond our control, I think there's also some element of how do we make that legible, rather than letting it be silent, rather than letting it be an unknown or unheard, right? How do we recognize? And I was actually struck by, Elspeth, the land acknowledgement, right? In which you're not just talking about, where you are in Toronto, but, thinking also about the, fiber optic cables, right? And the lands where they are, right?
So I see a number of, Nicole has dropped a number of links in the chat, and Peter has dropped a link. I think, Peter, you've got a link. Maybe you want to come on and tell us.
That was an accidental
Oh, that was an
link.
accident. Sorry. Okay, sorry about that.
Pasted in the wrong box, sorry.
Could be worse, Peter. That's all I have to say. Could be worse.
No problem. So are there any final questions or comments that people want to share about their experience with projects and their navigation of some of these questions, and any further questions for Roopika herself? Leslie. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess it's a broader question. I mean, of course, sustainability is a never-ending challenge. We've, I think, all experienced this. You know, we start project years ago, only to find that not only are they hard to sustain, they can't even be archived. We have no way of archiving them because the codings doesn't work in new format and all that. So we have to find really expensive way to simulate the past experience and so forth. So it was really about not reinventing also, right? But somehow it's hard to really get us to be really sharing and collaborating across institution and disciplines, right? So, I mean, I'm looking at us struggling this for 20 some odd years now, and we're not that far in many respects, right? So I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I'm just also want to see, you know, I want to grab onto something and say, okay, you know, how can we do it differently, seriously differently, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I mean, there's some dimension of this is always going to be a problem, right? The technologies are always going to change, and we're always going to have these sustainability problems. I think, for example, the Internet Archive has figured out how to preserve Flash animations, for example. The electronic people, Dini Grieger's lab, I think, Washington State, with electronic lit, they've done a lot of work on how to preserve electronic literature that uses Flash as well. So, I mean, I think the time is now to be trying to anticipate how we could still run our projects or make them available in some way when they're no longer with us. You know, one strategy, I suppose, is, you know, archiving with the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive. Recently, Alex Heel did a migration of a French historical project from a WordPress site to a static website based on Jekyll, and put it in the Internet Archive, and it'll actually run. It'll just be a static site running there. And that's probably a more sustainable way to access it in the future than the WordPress site. So, I mean, I think there are also ways we can think about how do we set up, you know, I mean, if people don't want to move away from using WordPress and other database driven content management systems like Drupal, then how can we create versions with the data that we have that actually could be sustainable because they're just text files?
Mm-hmm.
Something we can be thinking about proactively.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I do think that requires a bigger conversation, right? Because even the Internet Archive will run out of money soon. And so I'm just thinking about what is it, a broader conversation we need to have about infrastructure that's not going to be precarious on a consistent basis, right? That can we collectively do something about infrastructure that then guarantees some kind of longer term sustainability for communities across the boards, right? Instead of each of us struggling to find ways.
Mm-hmm. Elspeth, you want to come in on this?
Well, this is a topic dear to my heart. Leslie, we should chat. because it's not just about the technology, it's about the human infrastructure, it's about the staffing as well. And I do feel that there's a gap between the mission of the digital scholarship units within libraries, for example, who are always dealing with limited resources themselves and pressures around time, et cetera. There's a gap between that expertise and support and what the faculty members have available, right? So even if you're not ready to retire a project, but maybe your own research agenda has moved on to another focus, how do you keep the project available and accessible and looked after and maintained, and all the digital support that has to happen to make something function, even if the technology is not obsolete? And it's that kind of staffing position that it seems to me is missing within the ecosystem, at least that I'm familiar with at the University of Toronto, but maybe at other places. There are staff positions that maybe be in between the library and IT and VP research offices that do this kind of work. It's something I've been working on here at U of T with in collaboration with some of the librarians and other folks here, but I do find it a real big concern, especially if the research is grant driven. I know it's slightly different in the States, but in Canada, most of the research is, through a 5-year grant cycle, right? And so you do 5 years and you've made this great digital project, you're ready to move on to the next thing. It still has lots of potential to support the research of other scholars who might be coming to look at this, archive that you've digitized, for example, but it has no home. It does not have a home. It's not on anyone's list of priorities to be looked after long-term.
Yeah, in the US, we don't have the same kind of humanities funding that grant funding that you do from SSHRC. So it's kind of all over the place. I mean, there's a lot of people just kind of doing things out on their own. I mean, we have a lot more universities, right? And so there are just a lot of people over the place, like kind of working as a lone wolf. And, something that made me think about is I bet Nicole's gonna know the answer to this. There was an article recently, I want to say it was maybe by Joanna Drucker. I'm not 100% sure, but it was an article about I moved institutions and nobody's maintaining my project. Yes, that is so fun. And so I was trying to Google it to find it because it wasn't coming up. But it was it caused outrage on Twitter because what you're not asking about, my project isn't just living somewhere. It's about what Elspeth's particularly talking about, which is the human cost of labor in the maintenance of a project. This is part of, why some of us get accused of being evangelists of minimal computing, because, you have to update your Ruby gems, but beyond that, you don't have to worry about a WordPress update that's then going to break your theme. You don't have to worry about, your site getting hijacked and turned into Viagra. You don't have to worry about these things that often happen to content database driven content management systems. So it's not the answer, but I have this debate a lot with Quinn Dombrowski, who's at Stanford and is my co-vice president of the Association for Computers and the Humanities, about minimal computing, because she hates using the technologies. And we really go back and forth, because I say to her, okay, yes, it's hard and it's not worth it necessarily for any random faculty member who is doing a project. It may not be the right thing for them because there's, you have to know some CSS, some Markdown. So it's not for everybody. But the argument we make to her is that in her role as someone who supports faculty, it actually cuts down on time for her. because she doesn't have to worry about the updates. She doesn't have to worry about the hijacking of databases. And so she has an article coming out in Computational Humanities and the Debates in the Digital Humanities series, which I think, if it's not out this year, it'll be out next year, thinking through these issues around kind of what kind of technologies we choose to use for projects and the impact it has on staff.
Mhm. Mhm. Wow, you've given us a lot to think with, and this conversation in a way can, I think I can just see so many future conversations on digital infrastructures and sustainability, teaching, literacy, pedagogy, all spin out of your presentation today. So, thank you very, very much, Roopika. I'm going to let you have the final word, and then I have a few exciting announcements for our next meeting. But would you want to sort of wrap up by a few final thoughts or to share?
I just want to say thank you for this conversation. It was very nerve-wracking for me to present something that is so new and is the first. It's basically essentially an overview of where a book is going to go eventually, and sort of trying to bring together these ideas and think about what archives I'll be working with. So your feedback, your questions, your sharing your experiences has really been so wonderful and inspiring for the work that I have cut out for me.
Well, I hope you can, we can all reconvene sometime in the future in person, and be able to, welcome you physically to Toronto. So thank you again for a wonderful evening. I want to end by saying that there are some exciting, there's an exciting conversation to be, to watch out for. The next speaker who's going to be coming in is speaking on February 6th, Dr. Catherine Knight Steele on digital Black feminism. That's on Wednesday, February 6th, 4 to 6 p.m. And it's an event co-hosted by the Black Research Network. You can find information on this event at the DHN utoronto.ca events site. And please also, and I will drop the chat link here, in the link in the chat box here. Please also use the link to do some feedback for us. Tell us how you enjoyed this event. Tell us what else you'd like to talk about. And hopefully, I hope we see everyone back for our next weekend, next meeting. Elspeth, do you have any final thoughts before we sign off?
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming and for having this wonderful conversation. And please join me in applauding our fabulous speaker. So thank you so much. Lovely to see everyone, and hope to see you again at our next event. Take care.
Thank you.
Everyone.